motorhomediaries.com.
I'm David Humphries, and I'm in Roseburg, Oregon, and I'm here with the Motorhome Diaries guys at a sweet Starbucks. I grew up kind of thinking I was pretty far to the left because in school, whenever I would take any kind of a political quiz, my civil libertarian side would stick out because I hadn't learned much about economics. And I grew up with George Bush as my president, so I just assumed, that I was a Democrat or far to the left. And then during the presidential election, I started to pay more attention to the Democrats because I thought, far to the left, Democrats, right? So I got interested in Dennis Kucinich because he seemed to be more interested in civil liberties than any of the other Democrats who were running, and he was more against the war and against the Patriot Act and things I actually supported. But it seemed like his campaign wasn't going to go anywhere, and I was kind of watching it, and then I started to kind of look at the Republicans just to see what was there. And there was a guy who was talking more my language than Dennis Kucinich ever did. So I kept listening to him, and he just seemed like a better version. Instead of just being against the war in Iraq, he was saying, bring all the troops home. He was against the drug war. He seemed to be against victimless crimes. And I didn't completely understand what he was saying about economics, but I did more and more research on it, and it made more and more sense to me. And I found that it was backed up by, brilliant men who came before him, and I read what they had to say, like some of what Hayek had to say, a lot of what Friedman had to say, and other economists. And I found out that basically what I believed since I was a little kid, that you should be left alone, the government shouldn't bother you if you're not, hurting anybody, victimless crimes are ridiculous, was something that a lot of people thought and had matured on over time. Brilliant people had. And I learned about things like the non-aggression axiom, the whole concept of not initiating force unless it's in defense or fraud. And I slowly just drifted more, and after the whole Ron Paul thing, I drifted more and more towards, I guess Anarcho-Capitalism is probably the closest, but because I was brought in through Ron Paul as my source, I kind of have a different view on it, whereas I kind of see some kind of government involvement to spread the message not as terrible. And I'm involved in a few local groups. I'm involved in Liberators 11, which is a group that typically is trying to get City Hall to give a darn about anybody in this town and to actually listen instead of just being bureaucrats who do whatever the local special interests tell them to do. And I'm involved in a capitalist group in town, and some of us have been working towards making the Republican Party more libertarian. And it's been going pretty well, actually. We've got something like half of the Republican board in this town, and it's going all right. I guess after all of this and drifting more and more in this direction and watching things like what these guys have to say and what Ridley and them are doing in New Hampshire and what others had to say, I just find myself, this would be a good place to be if it wasn't such an overly populated state and if I didn't feel like Portland overcrowded things. So I see myself probably headed to New Hampshire at some point.